This is a jump. This is also a jump. They don't look all that different. One's a little shorter. The environment is different too. You could make some observations there. You could point out differences in the lighting, or maybe the walls in the first clip make the jump look easier or smaller, or maybe if you really paid attention in the last video, you could point out how the enclosed space directs the player to wall run across. And none of those are wrong, per se, but they don't understand the massive difference between these two jumps that are, on the surface, so similar. I kind of love this example, honestly, because out of context, you can't see what's different in the two clips. It's entirely self-contained within the player. They feel different and mean something very different to the player because they're separated by about 3 or 4 hours of gameplay, and in that time, you have changed. This is an interactive medium. You don't get to passively engage. The game is going to change you as much as you change it. But before we unpack that, and I promise you I have lots to say about it, we do need to set the scene a bit, mechanically and narratively. Titanfall is, at least, pretty visually comprehensible. Thanks to Call of Duty's wild success, the first-person shooter has become the most recognizable genre of video games, and has on some level stood for the medium as a whole. There's definitely something to be said about Titanfall as a comparison to Call of Duty, and it's actually made by the same developers, but not the same company, which is a can of worms we don't have the time to get into now, but I've chosen it because it's more than a traditional first-person shooter. First-person shooters are generally focused on the shooting first and foremost. There are levels to the game beyond just pulling the trigger, like getting around obstacles and having a good understanding of the space around you, but for the most part, the game focuses on the parts surrounding the guns. Aiming, shooting, reloading, and the like, and that makes sense for the kind of action and physicality that they're trying to create. Titanfall 2 doesn't do this. Titanfall 2 belongs to a smaller subgroup within the genre of shooters called the movement shooter. Movement shooters take a look at this genre and go, yeah, you see all that? I think the problem here is that there's not enough going on. Go faster! They take the normal shooter and add a level of action by making movement just as interesting as the gameplay. Ever wanted to dodge bullets? I hope so, because you'd better learn quick. This genre has become pretty popular among indie and smaller budget releases, but back when Titanfall 2 released in 2016, God, 8 years ago? Really? Sorry, I think I might need a moment. Titanfall release, right. Back in 2016, Titanfall revolutionized shooter spaces alongside id's Doom reboot, which is really good, by the way, if you're looking to relive some 30-year-old gaming memories. Yeah, it's not just me now, you get to do it too! Titanfall is as much, and I'd say more, of a game about movement than it is a game about shooting things. Enhanced movement is a pretty broad term, even within its specific gaming definition, but it generally refers to movement outside the realm of mundane human movement. In Titanfall, that means your wall run, which lets you keep your horizontal position while moving on a straight wall, and your double jump, which lets you jump again in midair, breaking a fall or letting you reach places you couldn't before. These form the core of how your character will move, and an experienced Titanfall player will spend more time wall running or in midair than they will just running on the ground. Granted, the shooting part isn't gone. The trick is just to figure out how to accurately identify and shoot targets while moving in ways that you'd never see in a game like Call of Duty. It's the opposite of hitting a moving target. The challenge, and fun, is in staying accurate while never slowing down. Now, let's put a pin in that for the moment and talk about the story. Titanfall's world is pretty simple, actually. It's set in a far-off region of space called the Frontier, where the Ruthless Interstellar Manufacturing Corporation, or IMC, holds nearly every planet in their iron fist. Recently, though, a new force called the Militia has been fighting a revolution against the IMC, starting with small-scale guerrilla attacks, but scaling up to actually going toe-to-toe with larger IMC fleets and armies, and at the center of this war are the Militia's pilots. A pilot is a name for a special elite soldier who connects to and fights alongside a Titan, a semi-sentient giant robot. Ironically, though, pilots break from almost all giant robot sci-fi by being perfectly self-sufficient outside their Titans. They're quick and nimble tricksters, able to use an array of gadgets and movement tools to appear from anywhere and disappear just as easily. Instead of just sitting inside their Titan, the pilot and Titan form a symbiotic unit. The Titan can handle larger threats, while the pilot scouts, flanks, and takes out targets that the Titan can't easily reach. Pilots are easily the most dominant force on the battlegrounds of the frontier. The presence of a pilot, whether a soldier or a mercenary, will almost always tip the scales of a battle in their favor because, as the game's opening narration says, a pilot can only be stopped by overwhelming force or an equal. In that sense, the pilot is the perfect representation of the superhuman player seen in so many shooter games, an unstoppable one-man army endowed with as much agency as the plot can offer. And that's why it's so interesting that we don't actually start the game as a pilot. Rifleman Jack Cooper, voiced by the legendary Matt Mercer, is not a super soldier. He is not a pilot deciding battles single-handedly. Instead, as he narrates the opening movie, we learn that he aspires to one day become a pilot. He tells us how powerful pilots are in ways that distinguish them from regular mortals like him.
Of all the things I've seen on the battlefields of the frontier, the pilot is the true dominant force. A pilot sees the world differently. Sheer walls become flanking routes. Pilots fight differently. Even overwhelming odds shift in their favor.
The pilot is superhuman, and we see that from the perspective of someone who is very distinctly human. Now, Cooper isn't quite as far off as the opening movie might portray. The first level, the pilot's gauntlet, sets the stage a little more. Cooper might be a normal rifleman, but he's befriended an experienced and grizzled militia pilot, Ty Lastimosa, who is giving him the basics of pilot training in his downtime. We get a short movement exercise, a diegetic way of teaching the player basic controls and movement, before arriving at the titular gauntlet, a time trial course. There's a pretty easy par time, but the player can run it as many times as they want, and there's a leaderboard with times from some of the other pilots in the story to give you objectives to work towards, and even holographic ghosts of those pilots to help show you where you can shave time off. The notable thing about the gauntlet, though, is that it's hard. To beat the top times on the scoreboard, you need to have pitch-perfect command of every tool that the game gives you, and some that it doesn't. I've played this game several times over, and I still haven't gotten above third place. So, when you do your first run-through of the game, you can play your absolute heart out and still not make it far up the list. So, after being introduced to the movement and tools of a pilot, you're immediately reminded of the difference between yourself and a quote-unquote real pilot. It's not like they have some extra speed boost you don't. Somehow you're both working with the same tools, but they've managed to finish this course in half the time you have. You get to decide when you want to lead the gauntlet, but once you do, it isn't long before you're pulled from the training simulation to attack an IMC planet.
We're going to see a new planet today. Maybe even die on it.
So anyway, he dies on it. Captain Lastimosa is killed in the line of duty, and as his last act, he gives you a field promotion to pilot and transfers his Titan, BT-7274, to you. I'm not going to apologize for that one. Cooper now inherits Captain Lastimosa's mission, to meet up with a Major Anderson and help him disable an IMC research project. On the way there, you rendezvous with crashed militia forces to break through a few IMC bases, staffed by their regular rank-and-file ground troops, as well as elite mercenaries from an organization called the Apex Predators, who will be the most threatening enemies over the course of the game. You fight alongside other riflemen to clear these bases, advancing with militia titans and finding stranded pockets of ground troops to fight alongside. And while this is passably important to our plot, we really care because one of these bases has our first jump. This section is from Blood and Rust, the game's third level, where the game has finished teaching you the specific mechanics and is now teaching you how to apply them. Let's go back to the gunplay for a moment, because we need a little more context to understand what's going on here. Titanfall is a brutal game by shooter standards. The game's time to kill, that is, how quickly a weapon can kill an enemy when firing at them, is really fast, all across the board. It's a little hard to tell without more context, but things die quickly in this game. And unfortunately, you count as a thing. Easier difficulties are a little more forgiving, But most of the time, if you get caught by an enemy, there isn't really anything you can do. Cover isn't all that common or convenient either, so there's really only one option. Never slow down. This is an intentional decision. This gets more into the idea of how developers curate an experience for the players, but the general idea is that the game is most fun when the player is constantly on the move, reacting and planning at 100 miles an hour. The enemies are deadly to put pressure on you and force you to act because you'll generally have more fun when you're pushing all of your movement tools to the limit. But we are still fairly early in the game, so we're still learning this process, and part of that learning experience is this specific jump. We're given a large gap with a sniper on the other side and a wall to run on. Normally, a sniper like that would be very scary. He'll kill us in 1 or 2 hits, and so we'd like to deal with him quickly if possible. So, as creative and attentive players, we'll try to get closer to the sniper, and in doing so, learn 2 things. 1, enemies find it pretty difficult to hit us when we're running on walls, and 2, wall running is pretty convenient when you need to get close to a bad guy to take him out. To summarize, the game presents a threat, makes you scramble for a way to deal with that threat, and then, using that way, helps you learn something important. It's not too complicated, and it's a practical way to teach you the kind of techniques you'll need to learn moving forwards. The first half of the game mostly operates like this. We work alongside our fellow militia troops as the obstacles in our way start to get a little more difficult, and slowly begin to understand the tools of a pilot. We still don't know quite what we're doing, but we can rely on them and on BT to help us. And all of this culminates in the game's halfway point, the 5th level, Effect and Cause. Now, Effect and Cause is widely considered one of the best first-person shooter levels of all time, and for good reason. It's a phenomenal work of game design and storytelling. However, because it's so widely acclaimed, there already exists a great deal of analysis on this stage, so no matter how much I want to, we aren't going to cover the specifics in great detail. It does have plot relevance, though, so we'll stick to the plot. Effect and Cause starts with a departure from the norm. We'll be totally alone this level. There are no militia troops here, just you and BT. That's actually more of a problem than you'd think, because this is where we're supposed to meet Major Anderson. And found him.
BT, I found Anderson. He's, in the ceiling.
Objective complete. We have rendezvoused with Major Anderson.
It's cold, BT.
Correct. Anderson's current temperature is 17 degrees Celsius, below the threshold of human survival.
Maybe even die on it.
Now we have to take over his mission, too. After a little exploring, we make our way to his upper half, lower half, I'm not really sure, and we find the coolest tooltip of all time. We're not getting into the mechanics of it. I don't have the hours it would take for me to express just how perfect this mechanic is. We are moving on. The rest of this mission involves playing 2 levels at once. You explore the destroyed facility in the present, and actually destroy the facility in the past, using the device to instantly jump from one to the other. The IMC troops in the facility in the past are absolutely dumbfounded. They think you're using some sort of advanced cloaking device, and are almost powerless to stop you from cutting through the facility's defenses. There's not much they can do when you can totally disappear and reappear at will. And it's in this mission, where you stand on your own against an overwhelming enemy force and totally outmaneuver and defeat them, that your and Cooper's apotheosis as a pilot begins. It's partially the time travel device giving you an extra boost, but the IMC grunts don't know that. And as we move through the level and listen to their radio chatter, we start to realize that they're talking about us like Cooper was talking about pilots in the opening.
We have an intruder, heavily armed and dangerous. Just spotted him heading towards wildlife research. Get the rest of the eggheads evacuated and set up a choke point.
The intruder has some kind of advanced tech and is slaughtering our response teams.
We've initiated contact with the intruder, but his movement is...
Tyler in Wildlife Research said 2 teams were taken out at the elevator banks in a matter of seconds.
Different on the unknown target. We're getting our asses kicked out! That's the fucking shit, Red!
By one guy.
They now see us like we saw pilots at the beginning of the story. And hearing that, we start to understand that they're right. Sure, you have a cool time travel device, but that was unceremoniously dumped on you mid-mission without much of a tutorial. You were the one that learned to use it on the fly. The game only taught you how to bypass lasers and block doors, and then let you experiment on your own so you could figure out how to use it to flank soldiers or escape from wild animals. You were given a totally unfamiliar tool and quickly learned its ins and outs to creatively apply it to your advantage. And the time travel can only take you so far. You'll still be facing overwhelming groups of IMC soldiers, and while it's difficult, we'll realize that we're actually taking on much larger groups than what we faced before on our own now, and winning. This realization slowly builds momentum across the course of the level until at the end of the level, we're practically flying through terrifying movement challenges and brutal combat encounters that would have seemed impossible in earlier levels. We finished the level with a beautiful set piece. What's going on here plot-wise is that the IMC have a super weapon that can rend time and space, and in going back to the past, we have messed up a test of that weapon. This weird time-stopped space is a result of the time machine having a weird interaction with the super weapon called the Arc. We climb up to scan the Arc so that we'll be able to track it, and then we discard the time machine and never use it again. But as we begin the next level, we still carry with us that narrative momentum. We run into another group of stranded militia soldiers, but this time things are different. They're holed up in a command center, and we come in and rescue them all on our own. We then talk to them. They're at a communication center, and they're trying to get a message to the militia fleet, and they need us to help reactivate it. Unlike before, though, they send us on a solo mission that they can't accomplish alone. They need a device from the depths of the facility, and they even mentioned that their previous pilot tried to recover it and didn't come back. Both the characters and the story are now treating you like a fully fledged pilot. It's no coincidence that the movement challenges in this level are the most complicated and, frankly, most fun in the entire game. And speaking of which, let's return to our movement, because now that we've gotten a better handle on our tools, we can start to move faster and faster. Movement in this game is complicated, but the basics aren't too hard to grasp. You can split movement up into two things you have to worry about. Things that can speed you up, and things that can slow you down. Speed is easy to get in small quantities, but hard to get in large ones. Just sprinting and wall running will get you a modicum of speed, enough for most of the game, but there are also smaller techniques that give you slight small speed boosts. For example, slide boosting is a small speed boost that you will get when entering a slide from a running state, so it's useful for starting a jump with a little more speed than usual. The other side, slowing down, is more important. A lot of movement options have top speeds. Walking and running have lower top speeds than wall running, which itself has a lower top speed than being in midair. Sliding doesn't have a top speed, but friction builds up pretty quickly to slow you down, so a lot of movement involves keeping yourself in midair as much as possible, punctuated by short slides whenever you touch the ground. Earlier I mentioned that experienced players will spend as much time as possible sliding or wall running, and this is why. Movement consists of keeping your top speed as high as possible while getting small boosts of speed whenever possible. No, that still doesn't explain what Snuggle Slide is. Don't worry about it. Techniques like this are, for example, how you can get to higher times on the Gauntlet. A casual player won't have as comprehensive an understanding as this, but they will be able to intuit the basics, and this creates a really interesting form of progression and growing stronger. Normally, games create a sense of power through giving you new, flashier abilities or leveling you up so your numbers get bigger. Here, though, we haven't gotten anything new. You still have the exact same set of movement tools available to you as you did at the start of the game. They haven't changed at all. You have grown. This is an interactive medium, baby. The fictional characters aren't the only ones to have an arc. You are growing alongside Cooper and becoming a pilot right alongside him, and it's just so cool. You can't see me writing this or reading this, but I promise you it is taking me every fiber of my being to not ramble about this, because it's fascinating what kind of parallel development between fictional character and real player can do in an interactive medium when you really let it off the leash. This is a tame example. This is a relevant and thematically appropriate example, because if I try to do a project about Spec Ops The Line, or You and Me and Her, or Darkest Dungeon, or Nier Automata, I'm going to go feral. I am going to collapse into a little ball of inexpressible critical analysis, and I'm going to go roll off into the woods and eat ground rodents for the rest of my life. I am sorry. I am trying so hard to be normal and comprehensible about this, and it's not working. Let's move on. We are gonna move. We're coming back to this, so keep it in your head. But we're gonna move on. Communication center and sending a message to the militia fleet. Right. At the end of the level, we get a message out to the militia, and they come to pick us up. We meet with Commander Sarah Briggs, the leader of the militia's pilots, and when she tries to reassign BT to someone who is actually technically a pilot, he stands up for us and finally explicitly affirms that we are, in fact, a pilot.
We'll get you transferred to a fully qualified pilot.
Objection. Cooper is my pilot. Our combat effectiveness rating now exceeds 90%. Request permission to retain this link.
You're lucky our backs are up against the wall, BT. Permission granted.
Briggs acknowledges us, and then we go into the final 3 levels of the game, which cover one final mad dash to recover the Ark. And it's in this chase that we're going to find our second jump. The Ark is on a ship, but we can't get close because an escort ship is tearing our forces apart with its anti-air guns. We're sent over to the ship to board it and take out the guns. You'll need to clear 3 balconies, disabling the gun on each one and moving to the next. This segment is brutal. As someone who's completed the game on the hardest difficulty, I probably die here more than I did on entire levels. Despite its difficulty, though, it never seems like an impossible challenge. It's made very difficult by a lot of fairly bulky enemies in very close quarters, and the challenge is precision movement. How do you keep up speed and always have somewhere to go to when space is this tight? It's chaotic and fast-paced, but always doable. And then, once you've cleared the area and disabled the guns, you take a short wall run over to the next balcony and do the same thing over and over again. Mechanically, this is the exact same movement as last time. We are doing just about the same movement, using the same tools in the same order. We're even kind of using them in the same way to close the distance while dodging fire. But the context and the way we're using them has totally flipped on its head. Way back in the beginning, this was a panic option. The game presented us with an immediate threat, and we learned something from our panic response. But now, we're beyond even doing this intentionally. We're doing it as a reflex. We aren't even choosing to use a wall run. We've been wall running whenever possible for the last few stages, and at this point it's become automatic. We think, that is how I get to the next balcony and leave it at that, because we know we'll be able to cross safely, and we know we'll be able to keep some of our speed out of the wall run, and we're already thinking about how we're going to make our way through the balcony surrounding it. We have internalized all this, and we have fully learned how to think like a pilot. Do you remember the opening narration?
A pilot sees the world differently. Sheer walls become flanking routes. Even overwhelming odds shift in their favor.
Back in the beginning of the game, a room like this would have been a brick wall. Back in Blood and Rust, a single sniper was a threat. These 3 balconies have half a dozen bulky robots and even more IMC grunts. A rifleman doesn't stand a chance, but you're no longer a rifleman. You, and Cooper, but more importantly you, are a pilot. The story goes on. There's at least a level and a half left, but I think we'll leave it here and return to the bigger picture, because I don't think it's coincidence that the villain of this game is a faceless evil corporation. They could have easily used an evil empire or a colonial government or whatever, but they chose to make the villain a corporation defined by their limitless pockets and vast territory. The opening narration sets the IMC up as an immovable juggernaut. They have more manpower, funds, and resources than the militia could ever hope to have. You'll defeat thousands of IMC grunts with the same uniform and the same weapons over the campaign, and no matter how many you'll kill, you'll never seem to put a dent in the IMC's resources. At the start of the game, Titanfall really wants to convince you that it's an underdog story, of the scrappy guerrillas biting at the unstoppable juggernaut until they finally fall. But it isn't. Like we've said, Titanfall starts you as an underdog, but teaches you that you are, in fact, more than capable of taking the best the IMC has to offer. And if you'll remember, we don't do this by getting special new powers or higher numbers, but by understanding what we do have better. That means if we go back to the earlier levels, we'll still be able to move and shoot like we did at the end of the game. Or to put it another way, we were capable of this the whole time. The message of the game isn't that Jack Cooper was given all this by Lastimosa way back when. It's that he could have done this the whole time and didn't know it. And if you play the game again, you run into concrete proof. And like I said, it's not a coincidence that the villain of the game is also an omnipresent faceless monolith in our lives as well. The game is telling you the same thing that it's telling its characters. You already have the power to change the world. You don't need superpowers to be unstoppable. The only thing you need is a little push, a little support, and a little faith. And you can fly.